Tyson, take it away. We're in the background if you do this.
Excellent.
I'm taking you over to
Welcome.
the...
Enjoy, everyone.
Hang on, everybody. We're about to move. Okay, there we go.
Okay, well, it's quite the introduction with a fight song. I'm getting the feeling, however, that that isn't exclusive to me. But you guys crack me up. You really do. And I'd like to first say that I'm honored to be here, and it was a great pleasure to be asked to be here. And hopefully everybody who comes and watches this session will get something from this session. It's not going to be full of dancing, but I'll do my best to entertain you to some degree. So what I want to talk to you today about is something that I'm very passionate about, and that is reading. Mostly getting students to read, and how to get students to dig a little bit deeper into their texts. This is a session that is going to be a little bit based on some things from my ebook, Academic Reading Circles. So I'll give you some links to that content, and hopefully it will interest you and you'll get something from it, and you'll be able to share it with your classes as well. So my session is titled Beyond the Comprehension Question. The reason why it's titled this is because I think a lot of times when we do reading classes with our students, it can be a little bit challenging to determine how much our students really understand from what they're reading. And one way that obviously most teachers try to gauge the understanding is through comprehension questions of a text. And that's fine and that's dandy, but there's a lot of times where the comprehension question may not really reveal too much about how everyone's understanding that text. And of course, it really does also come down to the type of comprehension question that you're asking the students. There's an art to creating the comprehension question. And of course, I think through what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and through maybe your own experience, you may notice that there's different levels of comprehension question. And today we're going to try to look at going beyond just those types of questions and having students really, really dig in and attack a text. So first, I think it's important for me to introduce a little bit about the teaching context for me, just so you can get a handle on why this has come up in my case. And you can relate it a little bit to yourself, possibly. And if you can't, then keep in mind that these activities and these things that I'm going to talk about are easily adaptable for different teaching contexts. And I think one of the things, if I remember back to the 30 Goals conference with Shelley a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that I tried to emphasize from that session that I gave was that everything is adaptable. Even though something doesn't really fit your particular context right off the bat, if you do a little bit of a search and you think and reflect on it, you can probably figure out how to make it good for your students. So let's talk about my students first. They are undergraduate students at the University of Toronto. They're all Faculty of Arts and Science students, which you can imagine is an enormous number of people and quite a few disciplines. The students, in my case, are all coming into the university from high school. So they have some limited exposure to reading from their high school grades, but these are international students, so they also come with different expectations of what the classroom's like and things like that. They take a first-year history credit course, and they take 3 language courses at the same time. And one of those courses is a listening and speaking course, another one's a reading and writing course, and another one's a university skills course. And I teach and lead the reading and writing course, which is where this has really come up. My classes are typically fairly small, 16 students more or less, and mostly Chinese. There's some Ecuadorians in there, there's some Russians in there as well. And I have the benefit of having quite a long period of time with these students. They are with me for 24 weeks over the whole academic year. So we follow the exact year of the university. So these students are kind of a pre-sessional type of students in a type of bridging program. And if they finish all of these courses, including mine, over the 24 weeks with a minimum of about 60%, then they get an offer changed from conditional to a full offer into their undergraduate studies. So this is the overall sort of context that you can sort of picture as I'm talking about the activities today. So what was the problem, right? Always whenever there's something that needs to be changed or something that needs to be improved, there's always a problem. And I'm sure we've all encountered problems and done a little bit of informal action research, and I too had done this. One problem that I noticed with the students is they really need to engage deeply with their course texts. So as I said, my students take a credit history course, and those texts are really generally quite dense and a little bit difficult for students to understand. So sometimes they're not the best text to really work with for language learners, at least in terms of improving the reading ability, but they do in fact need to learn how to dig into that text and really get the most from it. The reason for that really is because if they don't, they really have a sort of superficial reading. And what tends to happen in my experience is that the students focus a little bit on the superficial lexical problems in a reading before they really dig deeper. And I think that's natural, but it can be really hard for the language learner to overlook really just the mass amount of reading that they have to do and the vocabulary that they're finding in the text that's a little bit challenging. And they can come across with a fairly superficial understanding of a text. And that's really no good when they're asked to use those texts in their written assignments, on their exams, in their tutorials where they need to talk about the text with other students in an academic way. As I said, applied understanding seems to be quite rare from these students. They get the general gist of the text and they sort of understand the topic, but sometimes they can't even find the main idea. They might not be able to find the thesis or where the argument of an author is in that text. They might focus on details rather than the actual support for a text, and sometimes they can't really differentiate those things. And another problem that occurred in this case for me was when they had multiple texts, they had some inability to be able to pull content from the different texts and make connections between those different texts in order to synthesize that content into their own writing. Because most of the students in their assignments, they need to take a topic, they need to narrow down that topic, they need to create an argument, they need to support that argument with research, and a lot of the students really do tend to stick at a very superficial use of those texts. And many times, despite what I think might be an easy connection to make between texts, don't understand those texts well enough to actually notice the connections between the texts, and therefore their synthesis to support their arguments becomes very, based on a random quote or a poor paraphrase or something that shows that they don't really understand. So because that was the problem that I was finding with my students, we needed to look for a solution. And one of the solutions, of course, when you're dealing with reading texts is you pre-teach vocabulary, you have the students read through a kind of short text maybe, they look at the grammar of that text, you have some comprehension questions that they do in partners afterwards, you take that up as a group, and then maybe you have some discussion. But that type of typical lesson didn't really seem to get at the main points of the text that I wanted the students to understand. And I needed to figure out some way that I would get the students really to invest in the reading a little bit more, care about their reading a little bit more, and come away with something really concrete to understand from that reading. Because that's really what they're going to have to do in their undergraduate studies anyway. So the solution that my colleagues and I came up with was we'd heard about this activity called literature circles, and I'm sure that's nothing new to you. They've been around for a very long time. In fact, the ones I've cited here are just fairly recent uses of literature circles, actually. But they go way, way, way back. And the basic premise is that there are some different roles that you give to the students, and they read a book or a story, and when they're reading this book or story, they have different things that they're focusing on in the text. And they do that sort of individually, and then they come together as a group, and in a kind of book clubbish way, they talk about what they've learned from the different roles that they've done. And that worked really well in K-12, which is the majority of where the reading circles seem to, or the literature circles seem to have been used for quite some time. And then one day, someone decided, hey, you know, this might be a good way to get language learners to actually look at a text and get more invested in a text as well. And to my knowledge, Daniels and Furr seem to be pretty much the first group that tried out literature circles in an EFL or ESL environment. So they made little adaptations to the original reading circle roles that are meant for language learners a little bit. But what they continued to do, which didn't fit my context, was they continued to use fiction, right, literature. And some of the roles that the students were given were things to look at plot devices and characters and you know, the culture of the character, the speech of the character, and talk about those types of things. And of course, that's a really great idea for language learning. But in my context, we don't deal with fiction. We have a lot of nonfiction texts. The texts are typically on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of difficulty. I would probably put them at a 6 or a 7 maybe. They come from things like Time Magazine. They come from Scientific American. They have websites. They have journal articles. And of course, in history, they have primary sources and secondary sources and things like that. So we're not really dealing with literature and fiction. So the types of roles that Furr adapted from literature circles really didn't work for our context. So what we decided to do was to modify those roles into something that would have the students be able to look at our texts better and deeper. One thing that we needed to consider was we needed to consider the type of genre that they were going to be reading. We wanted to consider the type of writing assignments that these readings would be attached to, and we wanted to make sure that the reading circles had a robust feature to them. In other words, they would feel as though it was something that was academic and something that was really helping them towards their academic writing. So these are the 3 features that we considered when we adapted the literature circles into an academic situation, and I led that team, and what came out of it was academic reading circles. So I'm going to talk to you now a little bit more about what those specifically are, and we're going to do a little bit of an activity together, and hopefully you're going to get something from it, and you'll feel like a learner yourself, and you'll be able to apply these ideas to your own class. So the basics of an academic reading circle, or ARC, as we may see around the internet, is there is a common text. There's one text that you give to all of the students, and this may differ from what literature circles are like a little bit. So usually I pick a text that is either a required reading or something that's going to help them in an assignment, and I give that text to all of the students. Now, it's not like the whole class reads it all together. You also need to create sort of circles, which include groups of 4 or 5 students. So there will be, in a class of 16, 4 groups of 4, and each of those groups will probably be reading the same text, but they'll be focusing on it with their group. What happens then with that text is they individually read it outside of the class, and they're going to be looking for specific components that I give to them through each of the roles. So within one group, there will be different roles that each of those people in the group have, and each of those roles, which I'm going to talk about, focus on a different aspect of the text. And what happens after they read that and they look for the aspects of the text according to their role, they come together in class later as a group, and they share what they've learned about that text. So that's really the basics of what ARC is all about. So I think what we should do now is try to put you a little bit into the shoes of the student and try it out. And to do so, we have to introduce the roles as they are in ARC. So there are 5 roles in ARC. There used to be 6, so if you were an early adopter of academic reading circles, then you might have seen a 6th one, but we have conflated it down to 5. And these are the 5. So there's a leader, and the leader is more or less what you can imagine the leader is. But let me give you a little bit of a rundown. The leader really, his or her role is really to gauge the group comprehension at first and to promote some discussion about the text. So they manage the discussion in class, they create some questions about the text, and that's pretty much their role in terms of dealing with the text itself. Then the contextualizer is a person who looks for contextual references that are mentioned in the text. So these are things like people or places or events, things that the author may assume the reader shares an understanding of, but language learners may not, because it's in a different language and it's in a different culture, and maybe they're just young and they just don't know. So the contextualizer identifies and researches useful contextual references. The visualizer is in control of representing text concepts in a graphical way. And this is to give everybody in the group a kind of different approach or a different way to see something that's in the text that normally just through words they may not really understand, but as a visual they might get a different perspective. The connector makes connections to outside sources. So as I mentioned earlier, my students had some trouble being able to synthesize content from different places and not be able to really recognize the connections that are not obvious between 2 different texts or authors' points and so on. So the connector really tries to verbalize these types of connections between different readings that they've done, maybe lectures, history lecture in my case that they go to, and maybe really just their personal experience. And then finally, the highlighter, the 5th and last role, focuses on vocabulary interference. So this is the one that students typically do on a sort of superficial level by looking everything up in the dictionary. But the highlighter gives a little bit more guidance in terms of what type of vocabulary to look for and how those things will be useful. So I think what will happen, Hannah, I'm just sort of seeing your question, is as we go through the roles, maybe it will become a little bit clearer, and then at the end, if things aren't clear between the difference, then we'll talk about them together. So the first thing that I need you to do is to go to this bit.ly address, and it is where there is a sample text. So I put the link in the chat box. I'm going to have the text on the screen as well, but it might be a little bit small for some of you, and just so you can see it, and it's a handout that you can keep anyway. So I'll just give you a few minutes to go over there. And once you're there, you're going to see it really is just a handout, so you can download it. The first little bit talks about what reading circles are, and then the second paragraph is the actual text. So it's an excerpt that's taken from my book of a common text that practices the reading circles for teachers, so that you can get a taste of what it's like to be a student. And then below that, you'll see a kind of overview of what the reading circles are in terms of the different roles, so a sort of summary. So we're going to be focusing really on that second part, which starts with sample text excerpt. and it's here as well. Yes, you can tweet it. Go ahead, Shelley. So what I want you to do is take 2 or 3 minutes and read through this text, because we're going to use it extensively for the rest of the session. And when you're done that, maybe you can raise your hand or indicate that you've got a good read of it, and I'll be quiet now. Okay, 25 seconds left to read. Okay, so hopefully that's been enough time for everybody to get at least a once through of it. So as I said, this isn't a full text that I would give the students. It's a sample. It's an excerpt of a text that you might use with your students. And you can kind of get a sense of the level of language that's typically what I would use with my students. This is from my book, so it's always available there. And really what I want you to notice is you're going to be in the shoes of the student right now after having read this text. Now, of course, your language level is probably a little bit higher in terms of proficiency than your students might be, but there's still going to be aspects of this text that are unfamiliar to you. And hopefully you'll understand how the reading circles can help dig deeper into that text. So let's go through the different roles and see how they help you and a student attack this text a little bit differently than you might on a superficial reading. So the first role we're going to look at is the leader. And as I said, they're really, their main role is to situate the text for the students in terms of a basic level of comprehension and gauge whether the group really does understand the same basic stuff from the text before they start sharing their roles. The types of things that I want the students to do actually align with a couple of different talks I've noticed, particularly at iTFL. David Petrie talked about deconstructing a genre text, and one way he talked about doing that was to look at the text source, to look at the audience, the target audience for the text. And another session I went to talked about Edward de Chazelle's 12-step approach to reading based on a structured task. And in his book about EAP, he talks about looking at the bibliographic information as well. So these are kinds of things that I think the leader needs to focus on in order to situate this text. So what they're going to be doing is trying to figure out what is the purpose for reading this type of text. So why are we reading it, in their opinion, and how it's going to be useful in the future. They're going to try to surmise what the target audience is for this text. Where would you find this text? Did it come from a newspaper? Did it come from a journal? Did it come from a magazine or a blog? Who is this written for? They'll also look at bibliographic information, and this is something that situates the text in a more academic way. Students need to be able to cite information in their own writing, so the leader is a good person to practice this on, and they'll take where this text comes from and try to make the bibliographic citation in whatever referencing style, so that that practices how to write those bibliographic citations or in-text citations, and the group can share it with each other. And finally, they're going to be looking at sort of establishing a baseline comprehension of this text. Now, of course, when they're first coming together in their group after reading this text through their roles, their comprehension might be a little bit different because they're focusing on different aspects of the text. But at the beginning of the group discussion, the leader is going to ask some comprehension questions. So what they do is they write, in my case, 3 comprehension questions, and they answer those comprehension questions, and then they send them to me before the group discussion, and I take a look at their questions and their answers and see if, in fact, I agree with their sort of general understanding of the text. And then when they go to the group discussion where they're going to share all of their information, they ask each of the group members these comprehension questions and see if everybody sort of has a general understanding from which to start. So let's try one out. If I were the leader, I might create these statements. And what I want you to do is, based on that text, see if you can tell me which one is the key point, or there might be more than one. So, was it cyclists once influenced Jarvis's street lanes? Jarvis Street's infrastructure was reconfigured to allow for beautification. The bike lanes were not very safe. And or City Council reversed its earlier decision, which costs a lot of money. So, in the chat box, maybe you can type which 1 or 2 or 3 or all, which one do you think is really the key point from that paragraph? Okay, so it looks as though 4 seems to be an overwhelmingly popular number, and some of you are saying 1 as well. And I would agree with you. I think the key points from this text really are number 1 and number 4, right? So cyclists did have some influence on the way Jarvis's street lanes were configured, and in fact, the City Council reversed its decision, and that cost a lot of money. The in-between 2, I think, were just a little bit of detail that isn't the main point of that excerpt. And this is the thing that we're really trying to do with the leader initially, is we're trying to establish amongst the group of us what is our baseline comprehension. And I think based on what we have read in your answers, we've now established that 1 and 4 are probably the key points for this. Oops, and there's 5. I didn't add that 5 one there, but does everybody know who Rob Ford is? If you don't, it's a contextual reference, which we're going to get to in a second. But he made international news a little while ago. He was the mayor of our Toronto, and thankfully no more. So I would argue that he is not the main focus of that paragraph either, but he is an interesting part of it. So let's move on to what the contextualizer is. Okay, so here's the same paragraph, and what I want you to consider is I've highlighted 2 contextual references within this paragraph. And again, when I say contextual reference, I mean it's something that the author has referred to, either a detail, a person, an event, an activity, but they don't really expand on that very much. It could be a quote from an outside source like this one is, and they just sort of assume that the reader is going to understand what these things mean. But they may or may not. So a contextual reference is one of those things. So here I've highlighted 2 of them, and I want you to tell me, out of these 2, which do you think would be more useful for the learner to research and learn a little bit more about in order to understand this paragraph, even a little bit better? Okay, so if you're saying the first one, why do you think the first one is more important to research and figure out than the second one? Okay, so I agree with all of you in that I think the quote is the more important contextual reference to figure out. And just imagine if you were a student and you were tasked with identifying a contextual reference that will help people understand this text, particularly the key points, but not necessarily, but they'll help them understand the text more. You have to think, how are you going to research these things, right? Probably the students are going to do a little bit of a web search. And if they looked up that quote, they might get a little bit more of an understanding of what the motivation for changing Jarvis was, which is really the setup for this whole text. Whereas the second one, if you read it, the city cyclists declared victory, that pretty much is self-explanatory, right? There's not much that you can glean from that from more research, right? So it wouldn't really help the students to understand what city cyclists declared victory means by doing more research about that, whereas the first one will actually give more of a context for this paragraph. So now what I want you to think about is, given the idea that there are both useful contextual references to research and understand more, and then sort of useless contextual references, maybe you can, in the chat box, pick out one or two more from this paragraph that you think would be useful for the students to do a little bit more research about, just to get a better understanding of the context. So what's another contextual reference in this paragraph that is useful to learn? Okay. So I'll just let Yulia finish her typing before I help you out. Okay, so a couple of you said war on the car. Hannah said chevrons. Let's see what my suggestions are. So I actually picked just two examples here, and one of them agrees with what you've said, right? Mayor Rob warned the car forward. If you looked at that part of the text just on its own, you might skip over it because you don't really understand who that is and why he's called warn the car forward and so on. But if you research a little bit more about Mayor Rob Ford, you might get more background information as to how his city council made the decision to reverse these bike lanes. And I think that would give the students a little bit more of an understanding as to what this text is all about. The other one that I picked out was It's Reversible Lane. And I picked this one because I thought it might not be something that's so intuitive to everybody. Like, what is a reversible lane, right? You might not have them in your city, and if you don't, it's kind of a key point of this text, and by extension, the rest of the text as well. So I think the contextual references like these two might be good ones to look up. And even though Hannah, I saw you said chevron, I'm not sure that that's good or bad, but chevron is obviously going to be something that the students may not know, but I think it's actually a vocabulary interference word. In other words, it's really just a word that they need the definition of, as opposed to something that will provide context so much, like Mayor Rob on the Ford, or what a reversible lane is, or this quote. So a contextual reference really does help provide context for the reader in a way that they may not understand simply by looking something up in the dictionary. So let's take a look at visualizer now. And I'm going through these roles a little bit quickly so we can get through them. So I mentioned the visualizer's role is to take an aspect of this text that is really just in words and represent it in a graphical form. And the graphical form could be many different things. It could be a timeline, it could be a photo, it could be cartoons, it could be graphs and charts, right? Any type of visual representation is what I mean by this. So when you read through this again, what type of visual do you think would illuminate an aspect of this text for the students? So put your thinking caps on, and if you're going to draw or source some type of visual, what do you think would be a good one to see? Okay, so we've got maps. What the bike lanes look like. Yep. How they conflict with the cars a little bit. Sure. Yep. Okay. What I think the key point here is you want the students to really understand that the visual that they're picking is going to be something that's going to help understand a part of this text a little bit better. And there's lots and lots of visuals that students could find that may not quite do it. And in the book, I give examples of ones that are not so good as well. I don't do that in this session because I want to focus on the good stuff. But students do tend to like Google Images, so they do tend to find photos quite a bit, and not always are photos the best choice. But some of you came up with some good suggestions, and I think maybe we might agree. So here's one example of a pretty good visual that I think would help provide some context and some understanding. And you can't see it so well, but it's a Google map, and it shows how Jarvis Street is situated within Toronto. And before and after this excerpt in the text, it talks a little bit about some landmarks that are in Toronto in terms of other streets and other roads and so on. And this might be a good way for students to really get a visual of where Jarvis Street is situated, especially if they don't come from this city. This agrees with several of your choices. This is a picture of Jarvis Street and the bike lanes that run Jarvis. Now this photo was sourced from Google Images, and it gives quite a bit of sort of interesting conceptual information. One of which is that that bike lane there, you can see, really is clearly unsafe. You know, it's only painted lines on the road. There's nothing separating it from the vehicular traffic. You can also see that these people look to be part of a group. And there's a poster on that post that says "Save our bike lanes," and you can see this was happening around the same time that Mayor Rob Ford was deciding to get rid of the bike lanes there. And what you can see is this gives a nice little understanding to the students, a visual understanding of what was happening at the time, and how the cyclists really did want to keep those bike lanes there. And then finally, one that becomes kind of popular with the students after a while, once they get used to it, is political cartoons. And in this political cartoon, it really talks more about what the attitude was towards the bike lanes and how taking away the bike lanes was not very much a happy decision for those cyclists. So students tend to like these types of visuals. And like I said, the visualizer, initially they're going to be a little bit again, superficial. They're going to pick photos most of the time. They might pick a photo of, you know, a random bike lane, something that isn't Jarvis Street. They might pick a photo of, you know, Jarvis Street sign, you know, which is sort of useless. So they're going to need some coaching as to what type of visuals might be useful. But usually what I do is I provide a couple of visuals myself just to get them going and model each of these roles as we do these texts too. So here we come to the connector, and hopefully this will answer the question about what the difference is between the connector and the contextualizer. So I mentioned that the contextualizer is looking for not vocabulary necessarily, but maybe chunks of language or people or places or things that the author refers to but doesn't really talk about so much. And the connector is doing something a little bit different. What the connector is going to be doing is trying to make connections to outside sources. And by outside sources, I mean their own life, or other texts that they have read, or videos that they have watched, or newspaper articles, or things that are happening currently in the news. Something that's going to help them understand what's going on in this text simply because they're more familiar with whatever they're connecting it to. And we do this all the time. Whenever we read something that's brand new to us, if I was reading something about what was happening in Greece, for example, in terms of the economy and the political situation that's going on, I'm not in that situation and I don't have experience with that, but I might be able to read something in the text that reminds me of something in my own life, for example, that would help me understand it a little bit better. So we ask students to do this as well, and on an academic side, this really sets up being able to synthesize ideas from multiple texts and be able to create those connections between multiple texts. So here's a couple of questions that I would potentially, if I were a connector, ask of the group. Now, because we're in a teacher training session, of course I'm putting together questions that are a little bit more for you guys. But one question you might ask is, have there ever been any other asinine government decisions that you're familiar with? Right? This pretty much is what the author's point is in this text. So I'm trying to make a connection to another event, maybe from my own life. Another question, does this situation remind you of anything from your other classes? So students are taking in more than one class, not just yours. Maybe they've read something in another class that this has some connection to in one way or another. So connection to their other studies. Another question, does the configuration of Jarvis Street remind you of a street you know? Right? This is connecting to personal experience, right? It's probably one of the easiest ways we make connections is to think of, okay, well, I don't live in this city and I've never been to Jarvis Street, but in order to help me understand what's going on and how Jarvis looks, is there a street in my own town that kind of has a similar configuration with a reversible lane or bike lanes, and that can be something that the group can discuss and try to help each other understand a little bit more. So the connector, really what they're doing here is they're trying to make connections, as I said, as opposed to focusing on particular people or places or events. They're just trying to help the rest of their team understand or make connections themselves between what other events that they're familiar with or their other studies or their personal experience, just in order to illuminate that understanding of the text a little bit more. So hopefully maybe now you can understand a little bit more of the difference between the connector and the contextualizer. Now the last role is the highlighter, and this one is the one where I told you it's about vocabulary interference. And what I mean by that is vocabulary that interferes with their understanding of the text. Right? So if you leave them to their own devices, what tends, yes, chevrons are coming. What tends to happen is students may look up every single word that they don't know. And some of those words are useful, some of those words are infrequent, some of those words they'll never come across again. And we really want to give a purpose for the vocabulary that's in here and not just say, you know, look up everything that you don't know. So I try to focus the highlighter on 3 different types of vocabulary. And the first is unknown vocabulary, of course, right? But what I want the highlighter to be able to figure out is what vocabulary is frequent and what vocabulary is obscure, right? So in this unknown vocabulary, it takes some practice, but we want the students to be able to recognize what's a kind of an important word in this text. And strategies for that go over in the book, but also you can do in your class, which are beyond the scope of this session, are kind of like noticing repeating words or noticing word families, things like that. Another type of vocabulary I want the highlighter to focus on then is topical vocabulary. And this is really important for academic literature because the students are going to be writing in their discipline at some point. And what you want the students to be able to do is write credibly. And one way to write credibly about a topic is to actually know the vocabulary that's associated with that topic, that discipline-specific vocabulary. So authors employ this type of vocabulary throughout the writing that they're doing, no matter what type of level it is. So in this case, you can imagine that there's different types of topics that are coming out in this little excerpt, and we'll talk about what those topics are. But the point of the highlighter, one of their roles is to really pick out what's a topic of the text and how can you find vocabulary in this text that's related to that topic so that we can use that vocabulary later on. Now I'll get to questions a little bit later. So the third and final type of vocabulary I want them to focus on is tonal language. And by tonal language, I'm asking the students to recognize bits and pieces that the author inserts their own opinion, and maybe it shows a little bit of a bias or what they're trying to get the reader to be persuaded to think. So let's talk a little bit about this vocabulary before the session ends. So the first thing that I want you to do is pick out a word from this text that may be unknown vocabulary, but kind of useful, and put that into the chat box. So chevron is coming up. Proved costly, culture, sure, right, curbside, okay. So a lot of this vocabulary is probably stuff that is going to depend on the language proficiency of your students. But in my case, I might pick out these ones just as an example. Just from my own experience, I might suggest that the students have trouble with this type of vocabulary. And it's not just one word vocabulary either. It can be chunks of language. You know, if someone has their day, you know, that's not so perfectly obvious. And certainly you might not be able to just pick it right out from a dictionary. A cultural corridor might be hard. Make way, curbside, there's chevrons, of course. So this type of vocabulary might be something that the highlighter picks out, and in the context of the longer text, you might notice some of this vocabulary making its way into the text throughout it as well. So we might be doing some of these as an unknown vocabulary. Okay, so what the highlighter is going to do is look for this vocabulary, look for it in context, try to write out a definition, maybe another sentence that might be useful with this vocabulary, and share that with their partners. Now, the second type of vocabulary, which I actually think is the most important, and that's topical vocabulary. So if we look at this text again, let's think of the topic of transportation. So what transportation vocabulary might come out from this? Good. So you're picking a whole bunch out, right? So we can say if this is really focused on transportation in some way or other, probably if I'm going to write an essay or a research paper about transportation, some of these words might come up. So here are some of them, right? And I think you've picked most of them, right? We've got cyclists, we've got sidewalks, curbside bicycle lanes, reversible lane, existing 4 lanes. Again, there's cyclists again. Painted borders and chevrons, sharing the road, remove the bike lanes. All of these types of things are things that might be used, motorists is another one, might be used to talk about this discipline, right, this transportation discipline. So we want to ask ourselves as highlighters, are these words and phrases all about one topic? Can I use these words and phrases in my own writing to talk about transportation as well? Are there other forms of these words that can be useful in my vocabulary, such as cyclists, right? We would have cycle and some other ones. Sidewalks, you know, there might be synonyms for that depending on where you live. Chevrons, there might be other types of words that sort of mean chevron. And if you're not really sure what a chevron is, that's that diamond-shaped. I tried to do it in the in the webcam. Sorry. That diamond-shaped thing that shows how far away you should be from the next vehicle, or the next bike in this case. The last thing for the highlighter is tonal language. And this time we're trying to identify words and phrases that give off the author's opinion a little bit. But, you know, you might kind of overlook it. So is there anything in this text that shows how the author feels about what's happened to Jarvis? Can you identify anything from there? What shows their attitude? Okay, mirror. Yep, war on the card, or on the car, protests, for sure. So here's some things, right? Something proved quite costly. That sort of shows that they believe it's overly expensive. Even though the lanes themselves included mere painted borders and chevrons, that suggests that the author believes that the painted borders are not so good, right? Just 18 months later, that suggests that it was a little too early to change that decision. And of course, war on the car Ford, once you talk about that a little bit more, you're going to notice that it's kind of a dig at Mayor Rob Ford, in fact. So there's 3 levels of vocabulary that we're trying to focus on with the highlighter. There is the unknown vocabulary, there is the topical vocabulary, which again I think is very important, and there's the tonal language, which shows a little bit of author attitude. And the highlighter brings these things into the group discussion, so they draw the attention to this vocabulary to the group, and hopefully improve the comprehension of the overall text, so that when you do get to comprehension questions or a class discussion at the end, or their writing assignments, they'll be able to really understand this text better than they would have had they done it all by themselves. So, in summary, what happens in ARC is we have one common text that the whole class shares, and they're divided into groups so that there's at least 4 people in that group really to get the most out of a reading. It covers both individual but also group work and whole class, because after the class is over they can have whole class discussions. The way that the lenses work is that 1 week one person in the group will be a discussion leader, and then the next there'll be the visualizer, and then the next there'll be the contextualizer. So everybody gets a chance to try out the different roles. I usually do them in 1 week, so I would give the text and the roles to the group, say on Monday. They have 1 week to read the text on their own, and then we would do the in-class discussion in their groups the following Monday. So for me, that's about 5 per term. So everybody gets usually about 2 times at each role. They really do come away with deeper comprehension, and although I don't have any empirical data to suggest this at this point, trust me, they do. And they, in fact, use the text much better in their writing. So it becomes more of a collaborative thing, right? Reading becomes something that isn't isolated, and it turns into something a little bit more like this, where students become collaborative co-constructors of their own comprehension. So this is the book from which that text and more detail about each of these roles comes, and there's sample activities as well. I've used them for 5 years, and it's been a great experience. So if you're interested in the book, you can go to that bit.ly address without that extra period there, and potentially pick up my book. And if you have any questions, then I will be happy to answer them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyson. That was just
I tried to look at the chat box. But I didn't really pay attention so well.
We have some time for questions. I think Tyson can stick around a little bit. Isn't that true?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Questions for Tyson? Fabulous presentation.
If you put a question here, let me know.
There's one from Shelley.
Okay, so I'll start with Shreya, because that's the first one that I see. Have you had any challenges in making students understand the roles? Absolutely. They are not good at it right away. As with anything, it takes practice. So usually what I do is I do a couple of classes at the beginning of the term where I introduce the roles and I model them all for the students, and we do them kind of all as a class before I actually get to the point where they each have their own role and they're doing their actual cycle of a reading circle. So I start out modeling as a whole class. And then when we get to the actual text where we're doing an arc cycle, where the groups actually have their roles, I also do one of the roles, which is really good for whatever text we're focusing on that week. So when they're doing their in-class group discussion, I put some questions on the board about each of the roles to kind of guide them a little bit in case they missed something. And then we talk about it at the end as well. And each week I always do that so that students have a little bit more to talk about if their group discussion sort of falls flat at some point. Shelley, how do you feel about using annotating tools like Genius or Diigo for these roles? I feel anything that you can do to enhance the roles and make them easier or more interesting for the students, please do it. I haven't used either Genius nor Diigo, but I have used Google Docs quite extensively. So sometimes we put the text on a Google Doc and the students go through it and highlight different bits and make comments on the Google Doc itself. But you know, anything that can make the roles more fun or interesting for the students is a great thing, in my opinion. Peggy asks, do you grade these roles? In fact, in the book, I give some suggestions for how to make the roles a little bit more accountable for the students and for you, I guess. In my case, the roles aren't really graded themselves because each of the texts that we're doing the reading circles on is related to a writing project that they have to do at the end of the year. So the assessment really is the writing project, and without doing the roles really well, they're not going to be able to use those texts in the writing project at the end of the year, as well as if they do the roles well. So there's not a direct, in my case, grading of the roles themselves, but I prefer to connect it to some other assessment as opposed to having a whole other assessment just for the reading circles. So that's how I handle it. But I do collect the handouts that the students create for each of their roles and check them and see if how they're doing and if they're good, and give feedback based on that rather than grading them specifically. So Trinidad, NIE, Sri Lanka, how much time do you give to circle one reading? Okay, so there's kind of a cycle for a reading circle, and basically it's about a week long, I guess. It depends on how many times you meet with your class, but I would generally give them a week in my context, where on Mondays, for example, I give them the new text and I tell them which role they're in, and of course the group, they go away for basically that whole week, do their one role, and then they come back the next Monday and we do the reading circle in class group discussion, where I basically just put them into the groups, and for, in my case, about 90 minutes, the students just go at it and they talk in their groups about the things that they found in their roles. And the leader does, in fact, end with some discussion questions as well. And with the questions that I put on the board as kind of model or guide questions, it takes up that 90 minutes in my case pretty easily. And then in the second half of the class, the second 90 minutes, for some portion of that, we usually talk as a whole class about what they've discovered in their roles, and it helps me gauge how effective their group work was. Yulia, how much teacher's guidance do students actually need with their roles? Well, again, in my experience, they're not, just like anything, they're not really good at these roles at the beginning. So I give more guidance and more modeling with the first couple of texts that we do. And then as the semester goes by and we go through different texts and they see other people do the roles in their group, they get a kind of better understanding as for what works, what doesn't work, how they want to approach that role when it's their turn. So I would say there's some scaffolding involved in terms of modeling for sure, but I loosen the grip sort of as the term goes by. Shreya, does it involve out of class research much or work for students as well? Yes, it absolutely does. So that's why it's important to give students some time. Now, in my case, a week works well. So I give them the text, they have their roles, and then they do have to do some research. Not everybody, you know, the discussion leader really is creating comprehension questions and summarizing the text. But the visualizer needs to go find or create the visuals based on the text. The connector needs to think, more or less, as opposed to research, but think about how it connects to different outside sources. The contextualizer absolutely does need to do some outside research work, because they need to look up, you know, who Rob Ford is potentially and how he's connected to this text. The highlighter, of course, needs to take a look at vocabulary, either from a dictionary or maybe just the word, those types of things. So there's definitely some robustness to this activity where they can't really get by just having the text and focusing only on that text without doing any extra work. And that's the point, really. Maybe that's it. Oh, hi, Luke. Sorry, there's that last slide. But yeah, there's the book. I hope you all buy it. It's a wonderful book. I love seeing the stats go up and down. But in any case, hopefully you'll be able to take something away from this session and actually use it regardless.
Thank you so much, Tyson. We could just stay on and on and on and on with you. It's great to listen to. No,
Yeah,
what I
sorry.
meant is I could sit here and listen to you all night, even though it's 1:05 in the morning here. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Well,
thanks for having me.
Thanks for saying yes, and I hope you'll come back for the winter intensive. We'll have one.
That would be lovely.
Tyson, would you like to say a few words about Tobelta while you're here?
Oh, sure. For anybody who doesn't know, we have TESOL Toronto and BELTA, the Belgian English Language Teachers Association, puts on a web conference yearly, and this year on Friday and Saturday this week, we are doing our second web conference on assessment in language teaching. And some of you may be presenting. Luke Meddings is going to be one of the plenaries, so is Jeremy Harmer. And we've got Dave Dodgson, we've got Divya Madhavan, and a whole bunch of other people from across the globe. And I'll put the link to the Tobelta program in there. And James, I see, has...
And now that link's there, I'm just going to go ahead and stop the recording.